I was standing on the observation deck of ISV Defiant when the Kreth fleet came out of fold space, and I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I wasn't scared. I know that sounds like exactly the kind of thing a person says when they're trying to sound brave, like some veteran polishing their own story before it gets told at a dinner table. But I'm not trying to sound brave. I'm trying to be honest. And the honest truth is that fear wasn't what I felt when I watched 47 Kreth warships materialize out of nothing like smoke becoming iron. What I felt was something closer to clarity. Like the world finally made sense. Like everything that had been building for 2 years. All the diplomatic insults and the laughing. All the slow, grinding humiliation of being humanity's representative in rooms where no one took you seriously. It had all been leading to this exact moment. And I thought, all right then, let's find out. My name is Lieutenant Commander Yusuf Oren. I'm 34 years old. I grew up in Ankara, Turkey, in a neighborhood where the power went out every Thursday and the bakery on the corner made bread that could make grown men cry. I have a sister named Selin who still calls me every Sunday even though I'm 40 light years from home, and the signal delay makes real conversation impossible. I have a scar on my left forearm from a hiking accident in my 20s. And I have a habit of tapping my thumb against my index finger when I'm thinking hard. None of that probably matters to you. But it matters to me, because when you're about to tell a story about humanity standing up against something that didn't believe humanity could stand, you need to start by making the humans feel real. You need to remember that the people on those ships weren't symbols. They weren't archetypes or plot devices or representatives of the species. They were people who missed their families and drank their coffee too hot, and had arguments with their bunkmates about who left the light on. That's who was out there. That's who the Kreth decided to laugh at. Let me back up. 2 years before the battle at Sigma Station, Earth made first contact. Or rather, Earth was contacted. There's a distinction there that took humanity a long time to swallow, and some people never really did. We didn't go out and find them. They came and found us. And the way they found us was by showing up at the edge of our solar system with a vessel the size of a small moon and broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously in 47 different languages, most of which we'd never heard before. The message, once translated, was simple enough. Congratulations. You have achieved sufficient technological development to qualify for observer status within the Interstellar Cooperative. A representative vessel will be dispatched to your primary inhabited world within your calendar year. Please prepare documentation of your civilization's history, achievements, resource capacities, and threat profile. Threat profile? That phrase stuck with a lot of people. A threat profile implied something, implied that someone somewhere was trying to figure out whether we were a danger worth worrying about, or a resource worth extracting, or just a curiosity to be cataloged and filed under insignificant. As it turned out, the third one, mostly. The Interstellar Cooperative, which humanity eventually started calling the IC because nobody had the patience for 3 syllables every time, is a governing body of 41 spacefaring civilizations. It has a charter, a council, a fleet, a trade network, and a bureaucracy so sprawling and ancient that even the species who'd been in it for 1,000 years complained about the paperwork. Humanity was invited in as an observer, not a member, not an equal partner, an observer, the galactic equivalent of allowing a child into a board meeting so long as they sat in the corner and didn't touch anything. Earth sent 12 representatives aboard a retrofitted deep space research vessel called the Pioneer's Hope. They brought gifts, art, music, cultural artifacts, samples of literature in 20 languages. They brought scientists, diplomats, linguists, historians. The Kreth delegation met them at the rendezvous point. And the Kreth were the ones who laughed. I've seen the recording. We've all seen the recording, those of us who were involved in what came after. The IC released it publicly 3 months after the initial contact, and it spread across Earth's networks so fast that it essentially broke the infrastructure of the old internet for about 6 hours. The Kreth representative, a being called Valendrath, which humanity's translation systems rendered roughly as third voice of the ascending hierarchy, though the cultural nuance was apparently lost, looked at the Pioneer's Hope the way you might look at a child's drawing of a rocket ship when you've spent your life working at a real space agency. He said, and this is the translation, which the IC's own linguists certified as accurate. This is what they arrived in. This is their primary vessel. And there was a pause, a long, static-filled pause that the recording captures in full. And then there was a sound that the translation matrix identified as laughter, not just from Valendrath, from the background, from the crew behind him, a kind of rippling, layered sound like stones clattering down a hillside. The Pioneers' Hope crew, to their credit, didn't react. They'd been briefed on the possibility of cultural friction. They maintained composure. Ambassador Dhruv Sharma, who led the delegation, simply waited for the laughter to stop and then very quietly said, "We are pleased to make your acquaintance." And that became the image, that 3-second clip. Ambassador Sharma, a 62-year-old retired scientist from Jaipur, standing in the frame of a viewscreen with the stars behind him, the laughter of a dozen alien voices filling the air around him, and his face showing nothing except patience. Earth printed that image on postage stamps, eventually. Not because it was triumphant, because it was true. The thing about being laughed at is that it does something to you, and what it does depends entirely on who you are. Some people fold. Some people get angry in ways that are messy and unproductive. Some people spend the rest of their lives trying to prove something to the people who laughed, which is a trap because you end up building your whole identity around someone else's opinion of you. And some people, the rare ones, the ones who matter, they just quietly get to work. Earth got to work. The IC had a fleet, a massive centuries-old network of warships maintained by a rotating coalition of member species. The fleet was called, in translated terms, the Perpetual Guard, which humanity's military advisors found to be a somewhat grandiose name, but diplomatically chose not to say so out loud. The Perpetual Guard had never been called on to fight a real engagement in over 200 years. It existed as a deterrent, mostly, and as a projection of cooperative power, and as an extremely expensive symbol of the fact that the IC's member species could, theoretically, defend themselves if they ever needed to. Earth, as an observer nation, was not permitted to contribute vessels to the Perpetual Guard. But Earth could maintain its own fleet. The IC's charter had an observer clause, an old provision, rarely invoked, almost forgotten, that allowed observer nations to operate independent defense vessels within designated sectors. The assumption, apparently, had always been that observer nations were too primitive to build anything worth calling a fleet, so the clause existed mostly as a gesture toward fairness. The assumption, as assumptions often do, turned out to be exactly wrong. I joined the Earth Interstellar Navy in 2187, 2 years after first contact. It wasn't a hard decision. I'd been in the Turkish Air Force for 6 years, flying atmospheric interceptors. I had the technical qualifications, I had the psychological profile, and I had, this is the part that's harder to say without it sounding like a speech, I had the anger. Not the hot, destructive kind. The cold, focused kind. The kind you keep in a small box at the back of your mind and take out occasionally to remind yourself why you're doing what you're doing. I'd watched the recording. Like everyone else, I'd watched the recording of Ambassador Sharma and Valendrath's laughter, and I hadn't felt the urge to cry or rage or make speeches. I'd thought, I want to be on the ship that changes their minds. The Earth Interstellar Navy at the time I joined had 14 vessels. 14. And I can already hear you thinking what Valendrath thought. 14 vessels against 41 civilizations who'd been building fleets for centuries. But here's the thing the Kreth didn't understand. Here's the thing almost nobody understood at first, because the assumption had always been that newer meant weaker. Earth had 200 years of catching up to do. So Earth cheated. Not cheated in the sense of lying or stealing, though honestly, given what was done to us, I would have forgiven some of that. Cheated in the sense of going sideways. In the sense of looking at every piece of technology the IC shared with observer nations, which wasn't much, but it was something, and then looking at what Earth had already developed on its own, and then asking a question that apparently no one in the IC had ever thought to ask. What happens if you combine them? Dr. Amara Osaibansu was the one who figured it out. She was 31, Ghanaian, had a PhD in theoretical physics, and a second master's in materials engineering, and she worked in a basement laboratory at ESA's deep research facility outside Madrid for 18 months on a problem that most of her colleagues thought was unsolvable. She was trying to figure out how to make a weapons system that could punch above its weight class. Every ship in the IC's Perpetual Guard used a weapon called a gravity lance, a focused gravimetric pulse that could crack the hull of a standard warship at ranges up to 800,000 kilometers. The technology had been developed 6 centuries ago by the Tethani species, who were considered among the greatest engineers in the IC, and it had never meaningfully been improved upon because everyone assumed it was already optimal. Dr. Osaibansu assumed it wasn't. She spent 18 months proving that if you modified the focusing array geometry using an algorithm derived from human acoustic resonance mathematics, specifically a formula developed for sonar equipment used in deep ocean research, technology the IC had never developed because most of its member species didn't have oceans, you could increase the effective range of a gravity lance by a factor of approximately 3. And then she spent another 3 months proving that if you combine that range increase with a targeting system built on machine learning architectures humanity had been developing since the early 21st century, you got a weapon that could lock onto a target's specific gravitational signature, track it through evasive maneuvers at ranges approaching 2.4 million kilometers, and fire a precisely calibrated pulse that didn't just crack a hull. It found the structural weak points in the hull and applied specific resonant frequency to shatter them. She called it the Resonant Gravity Impactor. The Navy called it the RGI. The Kreth would eventually call it other things, in their own languages, in tones that weren't laughing. 14 ships. Let me tell you about them, because they deserve to be named. There was the ISV Defiant, which was the flagship and where I was assigned as Tactical Operations Officer. The Defiant was 800 meters long, which in IC terms was medium-sized for a warship, roughly equivalent to what the IC classified as a destroyer. But the Defiant carried 6 RGI batteries, a suite of electromagnetic countermeasure systems that Dr. Osaibansu's team had developed alongside the RGI, and a crew of 412 people from 23 different Earth nations. There was the ISV Resolute, commanded by Captain Yuki Tanaka, who was 55 years old, had been in the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force before the EIN, and was the calmest person I have ever met in my life. Not cold. Not distant, just calm, like the ocean on a day with no wind. There was the ISV Perseverance, which everyone called Save because the full name was a mouthful, commanded by Captain Amal Dube from South Africa, who was 38 and had graduated first in her class from the EIN Academy and had a voice like a radio announcer and the tactical instincts of someone who'd been doing this for 30 years. There was the ISV Horizon, ISV Integrity, ISV Prometheus, ISV Meridian, ISV Constance, ISV Fortitude, ISV Dawn's Edge, ISV Sovereign, ISV Threshold, and ISV Archon. 14 ships, 4,623 people. Small, yes. The smallest fleet any spacefaring nation had fielded in the IC's recorded history. But they were ours, and they were ready. The political situation, I'll give you the short version because the long version requires a drink and about 4 hours and a map. The political situation was this. The Kreth had been in the IC for 300 years. They controlled 7 star systems, had a fleet of over 200 warships, and had a long and complicated history of using their IC membership as cover for what most observers considered to be organized territorial expansion. Every 30 or 40 years, a non-member species in a region adjacent to Kreth space would find its communications disrupted, its trade routes mysteriously redirected, its planetary defenses somehow failing at inopportune moments. Nothing that could be proven exactly, nothing that triggered IC intervention. But everyone knew. And when Earth entered the IC as an observer nation, the Kreth were interested. Not in the way that means curious, in the way that means assessing. Sol system sits at the intersection of 3 developing transit corridors, what the IC calls fold space lanes, the stable pathways through which faster-than-light travel becomes practical. Whoever controls those corridors controls traffic between 17 different star systems, including 4 IC member nations and a dozen observer and proto-observer worlds. The Kreth had been trying to establish a foothold in that region for 60 years. They'd been blocked twice by IC procedural challenges. And now, suddenly, sitting right in the middle of the space they'd wanted for 6 decades, was a brand new observer species with 14 ships. No alliances, no history, and no one particularly invested in their survival. It must have seemed, from where Valendrath was sitting, like a gift. The message came on a Tuesday. That's a detail I always include when I tell this story, because people expect something more dramatic. They expect it to arrive during some crisis, some moment already charged with tension. But it came on a Tuesday, while I was eating lunch in the Defiance officers' mess, and Lieutenant Farida Nasiri was arguing with Ensign Park about whether the reconstituted noodles tasted anything like the real thing, and the coffee was terrible because it was always terrible. The message was from the Kreth High Directorate, broadcast simultaneously to the Defiant, and to the EIN Command Station, and to the IC Council. In translated terms, it said, "The Sol system and its adjacent transit corridors fall within the Kreth Directorate's declared zone of operational interest. All non-Kreth vessels are advised to withdraw from the following coordinates within 40 standard cycles. Compliance is expected. Non-compliance will be addressed." 40 standard cycles, that was approximately 31 Earth days. The IC Council sent a response within 6 hours. Diplomatic language, procedural language, language that essentially said, "This is concerning and we take it seriously, and we will be scheduling several meetings to discuss it over the next several months." The Kreth clearly had anticipated this response. They had planned for it, because 11 days later, before the IC's first scheduled discussion meeting had even taken place, the Kreth fleet folded into the Sigma Station sector. 47 ships. And they were not there to discuss. Part 2, before the silence breaks. I was on the bridge when the fold space emergence alarms went off. The sound of a fold space alarm is unlike anything you've heard planetside. It's a low, resonant tone, almost too low to hear, really, more felt in the chest than registered in the ears, followed by a sharp electronic chime that cuts through everything. It's the kind of sound that your body reacts to before your brain catches up. You're already turning, already moving, already reaching for your station before you've consciously registered what you heard. Admiral Marin Kovacs was in the command chair. She'd been there for the last 6 hours. I don't think she'd slept, and she looked up from the tactical display with an expression that I can only describe as the absence of surprise. She'd known they were coming. We'd all known. You don't send a message like that and then wait politely. You send the message as a formality because the IC's charter requires formal notice before military action, and then you do what you were always going to do. "All stations, battle readiness," Kovacs said. Her voice was level, not calm in the way of someone suppressing panic. Calm in the way of someone who'd made their decision a long time ago and was now simply following through on it. "Battle readiness confirmed," said Lieutenant Commander Priya Mehta from the weapons station. Mehta was from Mumbai, had been with the EIN since its formation, and had calibrated every RGI system on the Defiant herself. She had small hands and long fingers, and she could work a targeting console the way a pianist plays, fast and accurate, and seemingly without effort. "Navigation, get me a plot on all 14 of our ships," Kovacs said. "Plotted and overlaid," said Ensign Thomas Wiersbicki from Nav. He was the youngest person on the bridge. 22 years old from Krakow, had been selected for the EIN straight out of the academy. He had the slightly dazed look of someone who understood exactly what was happening, and was working very hard to function anyway. Good instinct, important skill. I was at the Tactical Operations Station, which sat to the Admiral's right on a slightly elevated platform that gave me sightlines to every major station on the bridge. My job was integration, taking the data from weapons, navigation, sensors, communications, and translating it into a coherent tactical picture that Kovacs could use to make decisions. It was, in some ways, the most important job on the bridge that wasn't command. I pulled up the sensor feed on my main display. 47 contacts. The Kreth fleet was arranged in a formation I recognized from the tactical briefings we'd received, a convex arc, like a crescent moon made of warships, designed to maximize firing arcs while presenting a curved face that was harder to flank. Standard Kreth doctrine, effective against the kind of fleet that follows conventional positioning. "Admiral," I said, 47 contacts confirmed. Creth configuration matches intelligence profile standard assault crescent. Lead vessels are Vol-class heavy cruisers. I count 9 of them. 38 support vessels, mix of destroyers and frigates. Kovacs studied the display. Estimated firepower. Individual gravity lance systems, standard generation. Total estimated output puts them at approximately 12 times our firepower on paper. 12 times? The number sat in the bridge for a second. And then Kovacs said very quietly, on paper. And I understood what she meant. I understood it the same way Mater at Weapons understood it, the same way Wiersbicki at Nav understood it, the same way the 411 other people on the Defiant understood it. On paper, we were outgunned 12-1. But paper had never fought a war. The Creth sent a communication 4 minutes after emergence. It was addressed to the flagship. They identified us correctly, which meant they had accurate intelligence on our fleet composition, which was concerning but not surprising. The IC's observer program wasn't exactly classified. Valendrath was on the screen, the same being from the recording 2 years ago. He looked, if anything, slightly bored. The way a maintenance tech might look when they've been called out to remove an animal from an air duct. Mildly inconvenient, already knowing the outcome. He spoke, and the translation matrix rendered his words in that flat, even tone it always used, which somehow made them worse. Commander of the Sol human vessels, you are in a designated zone of Creth operational interest. Your fleet of 14 craft is noted. You are invited to withdraw at your discretion. We have no desire to destroy you, as destruction of primitive vessels generates debris that is difficult to clear from fold space corridors. We give you this courtesy notice because your species is new and may not understand the scale of the situation. Withdraw. There is no outcome in which your 14 ships accomplish anything against this fleet. He paused. We extend this offer once. The screen went dark. The bridge was quiet for a moment. I could hear the ventilation system. I could hear Wiersbicki's stylus clicking against his console, a nervous habit he had. Kovacs stood up from the command chair. She walked to the front of the bridge, to the main viewport, and she stood there for a few seconds just looking at the Creth fleet. 47 points of light in the distance. Then she turned around. Open a channel, she said. The comms officer, Lieutenant Bao Yun, said, Channel open, Admiral. Kovacs looked at the screen. This is Admiral Marin Kovacs of the Earth Interstellar Navy. We have received your message. She paused, not for effect, because she was choosing words the way you'd choose tools, the right one for each specific job. We are not going to withdraw. These transit corridors fall within Earth's designated observer zone under the IC Charter, and we are here by right. If you have a legal challenge to our presence, the IC Council is available to hear it. Another pause. If you're not interested in the legal process, and here, for just a fraction of a second, something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood, then I suppose we'll have this conversation differently. She gestured to Lieutenant Bao, channel closed. The bridge was quiet again. And then Ensign Wiersbicki, the 22-year-old from Krakow, said very quietly to no one in particular. She actually said that. And Lieutenant Nasiri from the sensor station said, Focus, Ensign. But she was hiding a smile. The thing I want to try to explain, and this is the part that doesn't translate well into tactical reports or official histories, which is why I'm telling it this way instead, is what it felt like in the minutes before the engagement started. Every person on that bridge had a life, had a home, had people they loved. Wiersbicki had a mother in Krakow who still sent him packages of food because she didn't believe space stations had proper grocery supplies. Maida had a daughter who was 8 years old and had sent a drawing that was currently taped above Maida's weapons console, a drawing of the Defiant done in crayon, inexact and bright and perfect. Lieutenant Nasiri had just gotten engaged, 3 weeks before we deployed, and she'd been showing everyone the holographic photo of herself and her partner in Shiraz, standing in front of some roses. These were the people who were about to go to war. Not warriors in the mythological sense, not icons or symbols, just people. People who were scared, most of them, though they showed it in different ways. Some people got very quiet. Some people got very professional, very focused, snapping between stations with crisp, efficient movements that were partly training and partly a way of not thinking about what was coming. Some people, a few, A remarkable few seemed to get calmer as the tension increased, as though the external pressure was somehow organizing something internal. Kovacs was like that. I watched her that morning and I still can't fully explain it. It was as though the approach of the Kreth fleet had clarified everything for her, stripped away all the noise, all the bureaucracy and political maneuvering and diplomatic frustration, and left something very pure and very clear underneath. She knew exactly what she was doing, and that knowledge moved through the ship like a current. Sigma Station was a mid-size IC transfer hub, roughly equivalent in function to a large international airport, a waypoint for goods and travelers and diplomatic missions moving between systems. It had a permanent population of about 12,000, made up of members of 11 different IC species, plus the human contingent that had been stationed there as part of Earth's observer program. There were humans on that station, 341 of them. This mattered. This mattered the way that numbers sometimes crystallize into something more than numbers. 341 people, who, if the Kreth fleet moved on Sigma Station, and the Defiant and its 13 companions simply withdrew, would be left in a zone of Kreth operational control with no protection and no recourse. 341 people, plus 12,000 others who had no say in any of this. Kovacs hadn't mentioned this when she declined the Kreth's offer to withdraw. She hadn't needed to. Everyone on that bridge already knew. That was why we were there. That was always why. Admiral, my voice, my station. I was watching the tactical display and something had changed. Kreth fleet is reconfiguring. The 9 Vol-class heavy cruisers are moving to the front of the formation. Support vessels are pulling back and spreading laterally. They're lining up, Kovacs said. Not a question, not surprise, just acknowledgement. Yes, ma'am. Approximately 4 minutes to maximum gravity lance range for their lead vessels. And our RGI effective range. At current distance, we're already in range for 6 of our ships. The Kreth are at approximately 2.1 million kilometers. Our RGI maximum effective engagement range is 2.4. I watched that register. The Kreth didn't know that. Their intelligence on our weapons systems would have been based on what the IC shared with observer nations, which was standard gravity lance technology. Standard range. What the IC didn't know, what no one in the IC knew except our own people, was what Dr. Osaibansu had done to those systems. They were flying toward us to close the range gap. They were flying toward guns that were already aimed. Maida, Kovacs said, "Admirals, how confident are you in the targeting solutions at this range?" Maida looked up from her console. She had that calm expression she got when she was being precise. "I've run the simulations approximately 400 times. At 2.1 million kilometers, accounting for fold space variance and target movement, I estimate an impact probability of 83% on our first salvo, assuming the Kreth don't execute evasive patterns we haven't modeled. And if they do, 71%. Still," Kovacs nodded once. "All ships," she said, and her voice went out across the fleet channel to all 14 vessels, to all 4,623 people. "This is Admiral Kovacs. The Kreth fleet is moving into an attack posture. We are not going to give them the first shot. In approximately 3 minutes and 40 seconds on my mark, all vessels will execute target package Alpha. Fire discipline is absolute. No vessel fires ahead of the command. No vessel fires after the command ceases. We do this together." She paused. "Every one of you knows what this is about. Every one of you chose to be here. I'm proud of that. I'm proud of all of you. Make it count." Another pause, shorter. "All stations, weapons free on my mark. Part 3, the first shot." The next 3 minutes and 40 seconds were the longest I've ever experienced. Time does something strange in moments like that. It doesn't slow down exactly. You don't get this dreamy, syrupy elongation of seconds that films always depict. What happens is more like your awareness expands. You notice everything. Every sound, every flicker of light on the displays, every breath of the people around you. Your senses sharpen past what feels normal, as though your body has decided that every detail might be important and is cataloging all of them simultaneously. I noticed Wiersbicki had straightened up in his seat, both feet flat on the floor, back perfectly upright. He'd stopped clicking his stylus. I noticed Maida had her hands on the console, but wasn't moving them, just resting them there like they were part of the equipment, waiting. I noticed Admiral Kovacs had her arms at her sides, hands open, and was watching the tactical display with an expression that I can only describe as patience. The same patience as Ambassador Sharma on that recording, 2 years ago. The patience of someone who knows they're right and is willing to wait as long as necessary for the universe to confirm it. The Kreth fleet was beautiful in the way that dangerous things sometimes are. 47 ships moving in formation, the Vol-class heavy cruisers at the front, their running lights cutting through the dark between the stars. They were massive. The lead cruiser alone was probably 3 times the length of the Defiant. Size had always mattered in space warfare. For centuries, it had been the dominant variable. Bigger ships meant more power, more weapons, more armor, more redundancy. Size was why the IC's member nations dominated observer species. Size was why the Kreth came with 47 ships to face our 14. Size was the logic that had always governed this. But size doesn't decide where the shot lands. Accuracy does. 2 minutes, I said. Kovacs nodded. Her eyes didn't move from the display. 1 minute 30. I could hear the environmental systems. The faint background hum of the ship around us, 400 meters of metal and technology, and the people inside it. 1 minute. Maida's fingers moved. Just the slightest adjustment, fine-tuning a targeting solution that was already locked. 45 seconds. Wiersbicki exhaled, quietly. 30 seconds. I checked the fleet channel. All 13 other ships reporting ready. Resolute, Perseverance, Horizon, Integrity, Prometheus, Meridian, Constance, Fortitude, Dawn's Edge, Sovereign, Threshold, Archon. All ready, all waiting. 15 seconds. I thought about my sister, Selin, and her Sunday calls with the signal delay. I thought about Ambassador Sharma and the laughter. I thought about Dr. Osaibansu in her basement laboratory, working on a problem everyone else had decided was unsolvable. 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire. The RGI doesn't make much noise when it fires. That's the first thing people are always surprised by when they hear the accounts. They expect something dramatic. Thunder, vibration, the ship shuddering with the force of it. What actually happens is a sound like a single deep bell struck once, felt more in the sternum than heard with the ears, and a brief, brilliant pulse of light visible through the viewports if you're looking at the right moment. 14 ships fired simultaneously. 63 RGI batteries, each one locked on a specific target. Each one calibrated to the gravitational signature of a specific Kreth vessel, that signature tracked through the 2 minutes of closing approach by the most sophisticated targeting algorithms humanity had ever built. 63 shots fired as one. At 2.1 million kilometers. The Kreth lead formation was still 400,000 kilometers outside their own effective weapons range when the first shot arrived. I want to describe what we saw because I've read the official reports and they don't capture it. They describe it in terms of percentage of hits, yield estimations, structural integrity projections. All of that is accurate. None of it is true in the way I mean. What we saw on the sensor display was light. Not the explosive light of film depictions, not that orange and red eruption that filmmakers always use because it reads well on camera. In space, there's no atmosphere to carry the fire. What you get is white. Brilliant white light, sharp and clean, the kind that leaves an afterimage if you look directly at the display. And then the ship it came from starts to tumble. The Kreth lead cruiser, the vessel that Valendrath was on, the biggest ship in their formation. It tumbled. Not destroyed, not vaporized. We weren't trying to destroy them. Kovacs had been specific about that in the targeting briefing, for reasons both tactical and moral. What the RGI did to that ship was find the structural resonance frequency of its hull and apply a pulse that fractured specific load-bearing components. The ship lost structural integrity in its rear propulsion section and its forward weapons array simultaneously. It didn't explode. It didn't come apart. It just stopped and slowly began to rotate on its lateral axis, tumbling graceful and helpless like a leaf on a river. In the first salvo, we hit 41 of the 63 targets. 83%, just as Maida had estimated. In the Kreth formation, 7 ships went dark immediately, weapons arrays disabled, propulsion offline. 11 more showed significant structural damage as indicated by their erratic maneuvering. 3, including the lead cruiser carrying Valendrath, were effectively combat ineffective. In a single salvo, at a range they didn't know we could reach, before they'd fired a single shot. The bridge was, I don't have a perfect word for it, the closest I can get is stunned. We'd trained for this, we'd run the simulations, we'd known intellectually what the RGI could do. But knowing a thing and watching it happen are different experiences, and the gap between them was where we all found ourselves in that moment. Wierzbicki broke first, and I'll always love him for it. He said, and I'm telling you this exactly because it matters, he said, we hit them, we actually. And then he seemed to run out of words and just made a sound. Not quite a shout, not quite a laugh, something in between, something raw and overwhelmed that I think the word for is relief. And that broke whatever it was that had been holding the rest of us, and there were several seconds of sounds on that bridge that definitely will not appear in any official report. Someone said, "Oh my God," in Portuguese. Someone else, I think it was Lieutenant Nasiri, made a sound like a sob that was immediately followed by a laugh. The comms from the other 13 ships flooded the channel simultaneously, a cacophony of voices all reacting at once. And Admiral Kovacs stood at the front of the bridge, watching the tactical display, and let it happen. For about 4 seconds she let it happen. Then she said quietly but clearly, "Second salvo." And the bridge snapped back. Part 4, what happened when the laugh died? The Kreth responded. I want to be fair here because they deserved some fairness. They responded with discipline, given the circumstances. Given that their lead formation had just been crippled at a range they didn't think was possible. Given that their tactical models had just been completely invalidated. Given that everything they'd assumed about what they were flying toward had turned out to be wrong. They're not stupid, they never were. They were arrogant, which is different. Within 40 seconds of our first salvo, the Kreth fleet executed an emergency formation change. The remaining heavy cruisers pulled back behind the screen of support vessels and began accelerating, closing the distance faster, trying to get inside the range threshold they thought was our maximum. The support vessels spread wider, trying to dilute our targeting solutions by increasing the number of vessels we'd have to track simultaneously. Smart moves, both of them. Based on outdated assumptions. They're trying to close range, I said, estimating they'll be inside what they think is our effective range in approximately 6 minutes. They're going to be inside our actual effective range in approximately 4 seconds, Maida said, and there was something in her voice that I can only describe as professional satisfaction. Second salvo, Kovacs confirmed. Concentrate on the maneuvering vessels, let the disabled ones drift. The second salvo hit before the Kreth completed their formation change. I'm going to skip the mechanical details of salvos 3 through 7. Not because they aren't important, but because this is a story and not a manual, and if I wanted you to understand the tactical mathematics of the engagement, I'd hand you a copy of the official battle report. What you need to understand is what the Kreth fleet looked like 8 minutes into an engagement. They had expected to end in approximately 20 minutes with all 14 of our ships destroyed. 11 Kreth vessels were combat ineffective, dead in space, tumbling or drifting, weapons offline. 14 more showed significant damage, propulsion impaired, weapons capacity reduced. The remaining 22 were still functional and still dangerous, but they were also, now, doing something their formation doctrine had never anticipated. Retreating. Not in panic, organized. The Kreth were professional soldiers, and they were falling back in a pattern that preserved their remaining combat strength and covered the withdrawal of their disabled vessels. They were not running. They were reassessing. And during this reassessment, they hadn't fired a single shot. Not because they couldn't. They had the range on us once they closed. A few of their surviving vessels had achieved firing distance. They had fired. The shots had missed. This requires explanation, because it mattered. The Kreth Gravity Lance, in its standard configuration, relies on a targeting system that locks onto a vessel's energy signature, the electromagnetic profile generated by its propulsion and weapon systems. It's a reliable system against most IC vessels, because most IC vessels broadcast a relatively consistent energy signature. Earth ships didn't. The second system Dr. Osaibansu's team had developed, the electromagnetic countermeasure suite, was, in essence, a signature scrambler. It caused the Defiant and its companions to broadcast a constantly shifting electromagnetic profile that changed patterns on a millisecond cycle, preventing the Kreth targeting systems from achieving a stable lock. Without a stable lock, the gravity lance couldn't fire accurately at extended range. To hit us, they'd have needed to close to point-blank distance where targeting relied on simpler, more direct systems. They never got there. Valendrath requested communication at the 14-minute mark. We were in the middle of the fifth salvo when the request came in. Kovacs acknowledged the request, held the communication for 40 seconds while the salvo resolved, and then opened the channel. Valendrath looked different. I've thought about how to describe this moment, and I keep coming back to something small. His bearing was the same. His physical posture hadn't changed. He still held himself with the same kind of authority he'd had in the recording from 2 years ago, in the meeting with Ambassador Sharma. But there was something in his face, in whatever the Kreth equivalent of a face was, that was different. The ease was gone, that specific unconscious ease that comes from believing you already know the outcome. It had been replaced by something else, not panic. Not desperation, something more like recalibration. The expression of a person who has discovered that their map is wrong and is trying to figure out where they actually are. He said, "I would speak with your commander." "Speaking," Kovacs said. There was a pause. I think the pause was Valendrath trying to figure out how to say what he needed to say without the words feeling the way they felt. "Your weapon system," he said, finally. "It is not standard IC configuration." "No," Kovacs agreed, "it's not." "The range." "Is our range," Kovacs said, not unkindly. "Yes." Another pause, longer. "What do you want?" he said. And I have to tell you, those 4 words coming from him, after everything, after the recording with Ambassador Sharma, after the courtesy notice about Earth's 14 ships, after we extend this offer once. "What do you want?" It wasn't surrender. He was too experienced, too proud for that. But it was the question that comes before negotiation. It was the question that means I am willing to acknowledge this is a conversation now instead of a foregone conclusion. Kovacs took a breath. "I want Sigma Station returned to IC neutral status," she said. "I want your fleet to withdraw to outside the designated observer zone boundaries as defined by the Charter. I want written acknowledgement from the Kreth Directorate that these transit corridors fall within Earth's observer zone, and that any future territorial claims will go through proper IC legal process." She paused. "That's what we came here for. That's all we came here for. We didn't come here to destroy your fleet, Valendrath. We came here to make a point." He was quiet for a moment. "You have made it," he said. Part 5 after the silence. The withdrawal took 6 hours. It was a strange 6 hours. Our fleet held position, watching the Kreth pull back. The disabled vessels were recovered by Kreth support ships. We let them do that, didn't interfere, which I think mattered. You don't win a lasting peace by leaving disabled ships tumbling in space for the cameras. You win it by being, in the moments when you don't have to be, decent. The comms channels were busy. The IC Council, which had been monitoring the entire engagement from Sigma Station's communications relay, issued 3 separate statements in those 6 hours. One calling for calm. One requesting clarification on the weapons systems Earth had deployed. One, and this is the one that people on Earth would later celebrate, and that the Kreth would later try to have expunged from the record, formally acknowledging that Earth's actions were consistent with the Observer Nation defense provisions of the IC Charter. Legitimate, everything we'd done was legitimate. The Kreth filed a protest anyway. They would continue filing protests for about 3 months, until it became clear that the IC Council, suddenly very interested in the details of Earth's weapons technology, was not inclined to rule in the Kreth's favor. I stepped out of my station about 2 hours into the withdrawal, when the tactical situation had stabilized enough that I could trust my second to cover it. I walked down to one of the observation corridors on the ship's port side, a narrow passage with a viewport that looks out to the side rather than forward, which means you see the space beside you rather than the space you're heading into. I stood at that viewport for a long time. The stars were the same. That's what I kept coming back to, All of this, all the tension, the laughter, the preparation, the 14 minutes of engagement that had changed, depending on your perspective, either everything or nothing, and the stars were just exactly the same. Unmoving, indifferent, older than any of us. There was a hand on my shoulder. I turned. It was Maida. She'd left her station too, apparently. She had that look she got after something intense, not tired exactly, more like someone who's been running for a long time and has finally slowed to a walk, and the slowness feels strange. She stood beside me and looked out the viewport. 83%, she said quietly. That's what you said, I agreed. I'd run the simulation 437 times. She paused. I was still scared it was wrong. I looked at her. Were you scared before we fired? She thought about it. The honest pause of someone who's not going to give you the comfortable answer just because it's comfortable. Yes, she said. I was scared and I fired anyway. She looked back at the stars. That's the whole story, isn't it? That's what it always is. The recording from Sigma Station's external cameras was released about a week later. It caught the moment from an external vantage point, a wide angle that showed the Defiant in the foreground and the Kreth formation in the distance, and the moment the first salvo fired. 14 ships all at once, those pulses of brilliant white light, and then the lead formation beginning to tumble and drift. And there was audio. Sigma Station's communication systems had been monitoring the fleet channel. The audio from the bridge was partially captured. The moment that people played on a loop, the moment that got used in news broadcasts and documentaries, and eventually a commemorative projection display in the atrium of the UN General Assembly building in New York, was the 4 seconds after the first salvo hit. Those 4 seconds of voices, Wierzbicki's sound that wasn't quite a shout, the Portuguese "Oh my God," Nasiri's laugh cry, the flood of voices from 13 other ships coming in over the fleet channel. And then very clearly, Admiral Kovacs. Second salvo. People played that clip. They played it over and over. And what they were hearing, I think, what they were feeling when they heard it, wasn't triumph. It was something quieter than triumph, something more like vindication. The sound of all those years of being told you're too small, too primitive, too new, finally meeting the moment when the evidence said otherwise. It sounded like, of course, Part 6, the weight of what we proved. 3 months after Sigma Station, Earth was granted provisional membership in the IC. Not observer status, membership. The difference was significant in terms of rights, in terms of council votes, in terms of legal standing, in terms of what happened if someone decided to park 47 warships in your star system again. The vote wasn't unanimous. 17 member species voted in favor immediately. 12 more joined over the following week, after reading the technical analysis of Earth's weapons systems that the IC's Scientific Council had compiled. The remaining 12 either abstained or delayed their votes. The Kreth voted against, which was their right, and which mattered approximately as much as their original laughter had mattered in the end. Ambassador Sharma was there for the vote, the same man from the recording. He was 64 now, 2 years older, and when the final tally was announced, he sat very still in his seat in the IC Council chamber for a long moment. And then he said, to the aide sitting next to him, in a voice quiet enough that it almost wasn't caught on the chamber's audio system, "I'd like to send a message to the Defiant." The message came through while we were in the middle of a very mundane post-engagement systems maintenance review. It was transmitted to Admiral Kovacs, who read it and then called the whole crew together on the main ship's channel. She read it aloud. It was short. Ambassador Sharma was a scientist by training, not a speechmaker. He wrote in complete sentences and without flourish, which is maybe why what he wrote landed the way it did. He wrote, "To the crew of the ISV Defiant and all vessels of Earth's fleet. I was in a room 2 years ago when people laughed at what we were. I stayed calm because I believed in us, but I want to be honest. There were moments when I wasn't sure I was right to. You have removed all remaining doubt. The stars remember what happened at Sigma Station, even if we sometimes don't. Come home safely." Sharma. The ship's channel was quiet for a moment after Kovacs finished reading. And then Wierzbicki said, very quietly, "The stars remember." And it stuck, the way those things stick sometimes. "I want to tell you about one more thing. Something that happened quietly without cameras, that I think about more than any of the dramatic moments. About a week after the engagement, while we were still holding position near Sigma Station, pending the IC Council's formal proceedings, we received a private communication from a vessel belonging to the Tethani, the species that had originally developed the gravity lance. The Tethani were one of the oldest IC member species. They'd been in the cooperative for 700 years. They were the ones who'd built the original technology that Dr. Osaibansu had, in her basement laboratory in Madrid, fundamentally improved. The communication was addressed to the Defiant Science Liaison, a role occupied by a young physicist named Dr. Kenji Yamamoto, who was 29 and had been assigned to our crew specifically to interface with IC scientific channels. Yamamoto came to find me because he wasn't sure what to do with it. The communication was from a senior Tethani scientist named. The translation was complex, but he went by a name our systems rendered as Evith. He was, by IC standards, approximately 300 years old, which for a Tethani was middle-aged. The communication said, in translated terms, "To the scientists of the Sol human fleet, I have reviewed the technical specifications of your modified gravimetric focusing array. I have some questions, if you are willing. The acoustic resonance derivation, where did this come from? We have studied gravitational physics for 3 centuries, and this approach did not occur to us. I would like to understand how it occurred to you." Yamamoto looked at me with an expression that was half nervous, half lit up with something. "Can I respond to this?" he said. "That's probably above my pay grade," I said. "Take it to Admiral Kovacs." Kovacs read it, thought for about 30 seconds. "Tell him it came from the ocean," she said. Yamamoto wrote back and explained Dr. Osaibansu's work, the deep-sea sonar mathematics, the derivation that had seemed obvious once you knew that Earth had spent centuries studying underwater acoustic propagation in a way that most IC species had never needed to because most IC species didn't have oceans, or didn't develop ocean-going technology before they developed space-going technology, or simply had never sat in a basement in Madrid with the specific combination of knowledge and stubbornness and drive that Amara Osaibansu had. Evith responded 3 days later. He said, and this is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that I think is actually the heart of this whole story. I have been studying physics for longer than your civilization has had written language. I did not know about your oceans. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of assumption. We assumed we knew what you were. We never asked what you knew that we didn't." He paused. The translation matrix flagged a period of several seconds in the audio transmission that it identified as deliberate, a Tethani conversational marker equivalent to the human sigh. "I believe we have made this error before, with others. I believe we will have to think carefully about this." Epilogue, something they forgot to laugh at. Here's the thing about Earth. I've been in the IC Council chambers. I've stood in rooms full of species who are older and larger and have been among the stars longer than our species has had writing. And the thing that strikes you, the thing that you carry with you when you leave those rooms, is not the sense of being small. It's the sense of being different. And the difference isn't just in our weapons, or our oceans, or Dr. Osaibansu's acoustic resonance mathematics. It's in something harder to quantify. The Tethani are brilliant scientists. The Kreth are effective strategists. The dozens of other IC species range across every measure of intelligence and sophistication and technological development. They have things we don't. They know things we don't. They have been doing this longer and they have forgotten more than we've learned. But they have never been us. They've never had the specific combination of circumstances that produced Earth. A planet that tried to kill us so many times that we learned to be adaptable. A history full of conflicts that were catastrophic and terrible, and also, in the long run, produced generations of people who understood, in their bones, what it meant to fight for something and lose and fight again. They've never had oceans that forced us to think about sound differently. They've never had the particular cocktail of stubbornness and creativity, and sheer refusal to accept that a problem is unsolvable that you get when you've been told, over and over, by forces larger than you that you're not going to make it. They've never had the species memory that comes from being small. We've been small our whole existence. We built everything we have in the shadow of a universe that didn't care whether we survived. We built it anyway. We built it out of materials that were wrong and with tools that weren't quite right and on timelines that everyone reasonable said were impossible. We built it because giving up required an acknowledgement that we just can't seem to make. Valendrath laughed at 14 ships. He was counting the ships. He should have been counting the people inside them. He should have asked where those people came from, what kind of world produced them, what they'd seen and survived and built and lost and rebuilt. He should have asked what they were carrying with them from a planet they were 40 light-years away from, what kept them at their stations in the minutes before a battle with 47 opponents, what made a 22-year-old kid from Krakow straighten his back and put both feet on the floor when the alarm sounded. He should have asked about Ambassador Sharma, who stood in the middle of galactic laughter and answered with patience instead of anger. He should have asked about Dr. Osaibansu, who worked 18 months in a basement on a problem everyone said was solved. He should have asked about Maida's daughter's crayon drawing of the Defiant, taped above a weapons console. He should have asked about my sister Selin, calling me every Sunday across 40 light-years of signal delay. He didn't ask. He left. I still have a message from my sister. It came in about a week after the engagement. The signal delay means she'd sent it before she could have known what happened, just her regular Sunday message. She talked about the weather in Ankara. She talked about a movie she'd seen. She asked me when I was coming home. She didn't talk about the war. She didn't know about it yet. That message sat in my inbox for about 3 days before I listened to it. And when I finally did, I sat in my bunk with the privacy screen up, and I listened to her voice talking about weather and movies, and when are you coming home? And I thought about 14 ships holding a line in the dark, and 47 ships backing away from it, and the moment when the first shot fired, and everything that everyone assumed turned out to be wrong. I thought about what she didn't know, what most people on Earth at that moment didn't know, that something had changed. That somewhere in the dark between the stars, in the 14 minutes before anyone had quite realized what was happening, humanity had quietly proved something about itself. Not that we were powerful, not that we were superior. Just that we were more than anyone had thought. And we'd always been more. We'd always known that. We just had to wait for the right moment to show it. I wrote back to Selin. I said, the weather here is good, no real weather in space, but the view of the stars has been incredible lately. I'm doing well, I'll tell you everything when I see you. Might be a while longer than we thought, they're keeping us out here for a bit. There was a thing, a situation, it turned out okay. I'll tell you the story. I paused before I sent it. Then I added one more line. Tell Mom I'm fine, tell her that Earth's doing fine, better than fine. It turned out we were exactly what she raised us to be. The stars remember what happened at Sigma Station. Even the ones the Kreth counted on to witness our end. Even the ones that shone cold and indifferent on 47 ships and 14, and the silence before the first shot, and the light after, and the 4 seconds of sound that a planet would eventually print on postage stamps and name buildings after and teach children about in schools that were built decades after the people involved had grown old. The stars remember. Because the stars were there when we were small, and they were there when we stopped being laughed at, and they'll be there long after every ship that ever flew is rust in history. And if you're going to be witnessed by something that ancient and that patient, you'd better make sure what it sees is worth remembering. We did.